Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, and welcome to episode 178. This week's episode is going to be a little bit different. Yes, of course, I am going to talk about It, Welcome to Derry, Chapter 1, not Season 1, but I'm going to be forward with my opinion right here, and then get into it a little bit later, which is, I have seen all 8 episodes. I am recording this before episode 8 has been released to the public. Thank you very much, HBO. But I don't think I have an episode's worth of thoughts, so I'm going to give all of them spoiler-filled, you have been warned, and then I'm going to talk about Hazbin Hotel Season 2 as a whole, because I believe I haven't done that yet. This month's been so jam-packed, so was November, so there's just going to be kind of 2 short reviews, and then we're going to end the episode with my reactions to listener mail and question of the week. So let's jump into It, Welcome to Derry, Chapter 1.
When I close my eyes and I dream of you, I see your pretty faces and I taste them too.
I already discussed my thoughts on the first 2 episodes of what's now been dubbed Chapter 1. This is one of the things that is revealed at the end of the 8th episode, which I do think is very fun because, of course, this lines up with what was at the ending of It 2017, which was then redubbed It Chapter 1. One of the most fascinating aspects of what the idea behind the show is that we are going to see more of Derry's history and its relationship to Pennywise the Clown. We're going to be addressing more of its origin. Some of that was alluded to in concept in the 2-part film series, but we're definitely going to get much more of the detail. And I mentioned how I thought it was really interesting that this was a cyclical event, that every 27 years, Pennywise wakes up from his deep slumber and absolutely ravages the town. The first 2 episodes did a good job of establishing a lot of the main cast and relationships and families within the world that we are familiar with. And I think what's more disturbing about this as a season of television is you can be much more graphic with it, but you can also really push forward just what a terrible place this is. One of the most unsettling things about Derry is how it is filled with violence that most adults just seem to be disassociating from everything that's going on. People are vaguely aware of what's happening every 27 years, and I think this show is kind of a mixed bag overall, which is why I just don't think I'm going to be able to have very much to talk about it. As a film fan, or just, I would say it's probably classified more so as general, I have not read more than, I believe, 2 of Stephen King's novels, both of them ironically being Shining and Dr. Sleep, which, of course, Dr. Sleep, if you're listening to this, you know, is a sequel to Shining. I have never read it. That is an overwhelming thing. And again, if you're new here, welcome. Thanks so much for listening. The horror genre is not something that I overly enjoy. However, I did see the 2 It films, and ironically Dr. Sleep as well, and so I wanted to check out It, Welcome to Derry. Its connections to the larger Stephen King universe I found to be really interesting, specifically with Dick Hallorann as somebody we know is involved in this universe, mostly through The Shining and Dr. Sleep, but did have an experience in Derry during this time period. And one of the things that's incredibly off-putting about this particular era, and I'm sure it's only going to get worse because the proposed theory for this show is that we are going to go backwards in time and things are probably going to get worse. One of the main families in this is the Hanlon family, a black family that has moved to Maine and dealing with the almost extraterrestrial or supernatural investigation led by James Remar into the history of what's going on with Pennywise. I almost said a weapon, but that's what James Remar wants to use him for. And I really appreciate the use of the indigenous or the First Nation community in this universe and explaining much more of the history. I thought it was cool to see how that community viewed Pennywise and this entity that had taken on other, I don't even want to say modes, but skins, perspectives to who it was trying to haunt. That's one of the most terrifying things with Pennywise as an entity, is that he will encapsulate and become something that would absolutely terrify you individually. And I like how that through line is carried through this show. Of course, because this is an 8-hour series, it's much more of a slow burn than the other movies were. You, an hour into the films, are seeing Pennywise as he torments adults and children when it happens to be the losers returning to Derry in It Chapter 2. But in this instance, it's just with the kids. The adults who do get involved, of course, are the ones of the Air Force, as well as the people who are connected to Francis Shaw, who's James Remar's character. I am very curious, and I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of discussion with the origin of Pennywise being somebody else's character, that being Bob Gray, and how people don't like the idea that he was a human first, and that's what inspired Pennywise. It is one of those funny things where a character sees how people can be encapsulated and enthralled by a clown, and I've always kind of wound up being in the camp where I'm terrified of clowns, and I don't know if that is because of it or other things. I mean, the clown in Air Bud is also very unsettling, and it is interesting to see how we explore the history of this character, and getting to see Derry just in this show in 3 different time periods, that being 1908, 1935, and then 1962, and getting to actually see horrific events from this book's history, that being the burning down of the Black Spot. That was just really, really unpleasant to watch, knowing this is going to be part of this story based on the history that's established in the 2-part film series. This was something I did not want to see. I knew we were going to see it, and of course, yeah, we do. And the way that this show blends its history is interesting to me, because it could have been much easier to just give us 1962, but the pitch to give more of the back of this show, or I guess it would be prior, just based on how they want to release it, it's just confounding to me in general, but that's neither here nor there. And we get to see pieces of what's happening specifically in the past, but of course the focus being is 1962. What I'm really curious about is how much of the stuff that's been teased in 08 and 32, 35, 1935, I can't do math, yes I can, is going to be brought into the other seasons if we wind up getting them. I do really like our leads of the kids in this season. It is a pro and a con of this show that children wind up being the bait or the interested food, the prey of Pennywise. And in doing this event cyclically over the 27 years, you wind up with groups of children, at least in what we've seen so far, outside of It Chapter 2, but he is still preying on children in Chapter 2. It's the adult losers that are dealing with him as adults, which is rare. It was nice to see a blend of this, although of course we have characters who are drawn into what's going on. Leroy with his son Will dealing with Pennywise, and the drawn to children part seems to be specifically through fear. It's more likely to terrify children, of course, and obviously so much of this is incredibly obvious given the It books, it's a very, very long book, but the 2 films, the television series, and now with this prequel, I'm curious how much more we are going to dive into the origin of this character, because I feel, at least for the most part, most of the questions that I would have been answered. We get to see in a very long exposition-filled sequence how the community of First Nations feels this has happened through a story that's been shared through their ancestors going all the way back. And I'm very interested to seeing if we are going to get as weird as the book is, or allegedly is. Again, I'm not somebody who necessarily read it. I think by the end, though, with this, it does sort of feel like, okay, we're doing what we've seen before. Of course, there's going to be some familiarity to this. I've sort of felt about halfway through the season that the momentum was kind of gone. Episode 7, The Black Spot, is definitely one that is maybe I shouldn't even say maybe. It is easily the most intense episode of the season, and it is the most difficult to watch with what's happening, with the Black Spot being burnt down and everybody being trapped in there alive, and the horrific event that was that hate crime. And the finale is just more of what we've seen, which is traveling to take down Pennywise. Is 1908 and 1935 going to be more of that? Because at this point, they're really going to have to tell a vastly different story, because just having groups of kids and maybe some adults dealing with Pennywise, I don't know if that show works 3 seasons if those characters aren't allowed to evolve. There was a weird criticism and comparison done when It Chapter 1 came out, because it came out very shortly after Stranger Things, and it moved its timeline to the 80s. And one of the funny things, and I've talked about this with Stranger Things Season 5, Volume 1, is those kids have slowly aged, even though in real time they've been older, but those kids get to become more competent, similar to what It Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 did. We're not going to get that from this show. They're just going to be different groups of people. Francis is maybe the most interested character for me, but Dick Halloran, who is from The Shining, is going to go off and do other things, because eventually he's got to go show up in The Shining. I did like a lot of the references as well to Shawshank, that of course being probably one of the most iconic prisons of all time, and the police within this show just being an emphasis for how horrible this place is, specifically with what goes on with the theater owner. That was unnerving, and this experience is well crafted, but I do think some of the inconsistency throughout the show, yes, the slow, methodical nature really does work at the beginning of something like this, but it's in the middle when it just sort of feels like we are going to get to a place that's familiar. The twists near the end were cool, and it was interesting to see a definitive idea for where Pennywise himself comes from, but I don't know how much more about the entity they could reveal. So overall, I think the show's good. It's not great. I do think it's worth watching if you liked the 2 It films, or even if you've read the book and maybe haven't seen any of this, it might be worth it. It'd be interesting to watch having not seen the It films. I don't know if that would work personally, but it's a good enough show that definitely was terrifying, and I had to watch during the daytime. Now let's jump into Season 2 of Hazbin Hotel.
We can use the hotel's reputation and hell's renewed hope and start a hell-wide uprising against heaven with us at the top, huh?
I know you won't believe this, but I don't understand.
I know I made a TikTok wrapping up my biggest problem with the season, but, this gives me an opportunity to kind of expand on that. Overall, I do think this is a good season of television. What's really interesting, I saw an interview with Vivian, and she says that originally they were going to jump to Lilith and what that would mean overall for the show's world, and that it was pivoted to focusing on the V's. And while I think they are really interesting as villains, I said this in my TikTok, that there's no external threat towards the hotel. This season's exploration is purely on the reputation of Charlie Morningstar and if redemption is possible. With the ticking time bomb of The Exorcist returning in Season 1, we knew they had to do something by a certain point. I've seen some criticism of my video that, V's are the threat to the hotel, but in actuality, the whole point of Vox and the V's reaching power is to attack heaven. You could argue that would result in a war between the two places, and then that would be the threat towards the hotel. And I could understand that, but the show much more focuses on Charlie's whole livelihood is that redemption is possible because Serpentis was able to get to heaven. And heaven dealing with the aftermath of that was incredibly interesting. They have not viewed this as a possibility, and you really get to see the morality specifically from Seraphine's point of view that I've only viewed those souls, those lost souls, those thrown to hell souls, as a problem, and getting to deal with the idea that redemption is possible from the people who are supposed to be the good characters was really interesting. Lute's pure hatred of Charlie and Vaggie and what they did to Adam, fighting them off, which in itself is actually quite funny because, of course, they are defending themselves and their own lives, but they just assume because they're the worst of the worst that they're supposed to die again. And the back and forth with somebody who has lived in hell with Serpentis going to heaven and still missing his loved ones. The reason he was able to redeem himself was the sacrifice for Cherry Bomb, somebody he loves, and Cherry's whole point of view being changed because Serpentis did do that and was redeemed, and their relationship results in what I think is one of the best songs of the season. But where I think I did really feel some of this lacking is not necessarily as a problem, but it does feel like a pivot from the main focus. I thought the Vox and V's crew are compelling villains. They work specifically as a mirror to a lot of what's happening right now. Is that something necessarily that works really well? I mean, all of this is just based on my opinion, and obviously everybody's entitled to their own. I like those characters. Outside of Vox, I don't think Valentino, and I've now forgotten the name of the other V, and that's going to drive me crazy, Velvet, work as sort of hench characters. Of course, they're capable in their own right, but the focus is on Vox. Where I really do think this season struggled was, understandably so, people have their questions and they want backstory answered. I don't feel, at least in my mind, that the weaving in of characters' backstories necessarily worked to the overall narrative of the season. Serpentis was important. You needed to evaluate why that character was in hell and what he did in order to be considered a redeemed soul, thus getting brought into heaven. The only other one that we got a piece of information that seems like it is necessary to the overall show's story is of Angel's. He killed his father. We can probably assume as to why, but of course the show's eventually going to answer that question for us. When it comes to Alistair's and Vox's, those are compelling sequences, but at this current moment, they just felt like, well, you wanted to know, so here you go. I found it really frustrating that Vox as a cult leader was through television, which of course you could change that perspective based on how people on television and celebrity are able to amass followers and whatnot. But I thought it would have been much more interesting for it to be something that he had always wanted to be, which we see in his life he was able to achieve through heinous means, murdering all of the talent that was on his network. Alistair's as just an awful person who made a deal, and we do learn who he made his deal with. That's the only crucial piece of information to his story as a whole. Just like Lilith was sort of pushed to the side, I did like that Alistair's whole narrative in this season is just focusing on breaking his deal and getting to take advantage of Vox's stupidity. The back and forth between those two characters has always been the most interesting of the antagonistic relationships, and I did really like that. The Overlord sort of just following along with them was fine. I liked the introduction of more Judeo-Christianity characters. Getting to see Abel was super fun. I made a video about the possibilities of seeing other ones. Eve is a character I feel like we have to see in the near future if we're addressing a main focus point, which Viv has said we are with Lilith. I would like to see Eve. She said we're probably never going to see God, but does that mean we maybe don't see Jesus? That might be something that would be really fun to explore. I had fun with this season. Charlie Morningstar dealing with her reputation and if she spent her life on something that is worth doing, is it possible for it to be done again? The main crux of the hotel's focus is on that, But the one I found more interesting, and this is probably because the unlikely friendship of Husk and Angel was one that included two of the best songs from season 1 with Loser Baby and Poison, how that relationship devolves, because we do learn that, of course, Angel was another spy for Vox, being hypnotized by Vox and working for Velvet and Valentino as well, that he was the person actually giving them inside information. And I mean, I might as well address it. Baxter's there just to be there as a complete red herring, which is fine and all, but outside of his connection, which we are told near the very end, to Serpentius, he's a character that just sort of is there. I really feel that this season, more than anything, would have done better with maybe 10 episodes, or every episode being 35 minutes plus, because it does sort of feel meandery at points and not having any true momentum to what Vox is doing with his plan did kind of hurt the overall show as a whole. I liked it, but season 1 was such an amazing smash hit, from incredible music to really great storytelling. I'm very curious as to what we are going to get now that we know we're getting at least seasons 3 and 4. Is Viv really going to amp things up? We know what the colors are for the logos of the season, and people are, of course, going to bring their theories into what that means, but I'm not off the Hazbin Hotel train. I'm just a little more excited for where we could be going than where we were with this season. Let me know in the comments what you thought about Hazbin Hotel Season 2. Now let's jump into listener, mail, and question of the week responses.
Can I ask you a question? Just fun?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, what horror franchise would you like to see get a prequel? We got a bunch of comments on TikTok. God said, "Let me in." Rob Piera said, "Nightmare on Elm Street." Interesting. Ray1738 says, "The Conjuring, if they stopped being corny and spamming Annabelle." Okay. And then Zephrix05 said, "The Lost Boys." Guitar Talk said, "Event Horizon." Lego Pitbull, Dead Space. Samantha Luna said, "Hellraiser. I want the Scarlet Gospels movie first and a prequel to the lore of the laminate configuration. Maybe Hulu as the remake was there. That would be awesome." I don't know what any of that stuff means, but that's really cool. Aussie Bloke said Elm Street. Normie said Final Destination. And then Lachlan Broadfoot said the one with the black guys that get their brains replaced with white ones and they get reset briefly by flashing light. I'm assuming you're talking about Get Out. Jermaine writes in, The Devil's Rejects, House of a Thousand Corpses trilogy, or maybe Dusk Till Dawn. Okay, those are interesting. Legacy Odinson writes in, there's not a lot of horror icons that I feel need a prequel. Krueger series would be upsetting due to the implied nature of his crimes, and Voorhees series is already around. Leatherface is just rarely in good hands. That's true. Truthfully, what I want more than anything is a conclusion season to Ash vs. Evil Dead. Something to close that cliffhanger at the end of the last season. All right. Yeah, you know what? The Evil Dead franchise is just something for whatever reason, I've never been able to get into. Scotty Cameron writes in, it might have to be Nightmare on Elm Street because I believe that a prequel series could explore Freddy Krueger before he became a nightmare spirit. It could explore him as a janitor who kills kids, and it provoked the parental vigilante mob that killed him. It could be like the Hannibal show, which I know you love. Couple of questions. Can I switch between characters if an actor played multiple iconic roles, i.e. Carl Urban as Bones, Butcher, and Judge Dredd? They'd have to be that iconic. Can I, i.e. use roles to Cillian Murphy as Oppenheimer? I'm going to say let's keep it to pop culture stuff. Scotty, it would just be easier for me to remember. And then what do we have here? Dylan says, I have a hard time thinking of another horror franchise that would have a good prequel series because it needs a villain that I would want to watch win. Part of you thinks maybe Evil Dead since the Deadites are always fun to watch, but I think it's a tough tightrope to act. Hopefully I'll have watched it in time for your review and they stick the landing. And then we have Red Alcoholic 756, Pet Cemetery would be great. We got a bunch of different stuff. Thank you to everybody who submitted their question of the week responses. There's a number of them, which is amazing this week. Thank you so much for that. If you have a question for me and not an answer, you can always send it into the podcast. This week's question of the week is incredibly simple. What is your favorite James Cameron movie? To let me know, you can comment below on YouTube and Spotify. You can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com. If this didn't give it away, next week's review is going to be of Avatar, Fire, and Ash. I have seen the movie, and I'm very curious to see what the public has to say about this movie that is 3 hours and 15 minutes. We are so close to our goal of 500 YouTube subscribers before the year is out. If you haven't yet, it would be absolutely incredible if you could drop a subscription on YouTube. It costs you nothing, and it just helps the podcast algorithms. I know there's a lot of people who enjoyed my Supergirl reaction. If you want to see a full depth analysis of that, make sure you check out DC Studios' podcast on the Multiverse of Color. Andy and I were joined by a bunch of friends to talk about how much of this looks like an adaptation of Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow. I will make sure, of course, to leave a link for that in the episode description. If you're not following on your favorite podcast platform yet, might as well do that. That way you don't miss any of the shows. You can drop a review, and it helps this little podcast of mine get heard by more people. To everyone who joins week by week or at random, thank you so much for spending your time with me. I've said this already. Next week's episode is going to be of Avatar, Fire, and Ash. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.